Right, well, it is 8 o'clock, so we will get started. So, hello and welcome back to Send Searchlights, the first one of 2025. Before we do our introductions, I'll just go through those usual reminders for housekeeping. Please do stay on mute. But if you do have if you do need any clarification on today's topic, then please do put anything in the chat box so we don't miss it. If you've got any questions for future webinars, these can be submitted using the registration forms which are sent to you after the webinar, and you'll also get the recording of this one. And if we do mention any links during the session, then those will be sent to you as well. So as I say, welcome back. I'm Polly and I'm joined by Emma. So we are usually here to welcome you to our Send Searchlights. Some of you may know Debbie, who began to join us at the end of last year. And if you've been following us, you'll know that she's continued to have some technical difficulties. So a new laptop hasn't quite arrived in time for today's session. So she's not joining us today, but she will be with us next month. But we are very delighted to be joined by Dr. Helen Ross this morning, a special educational needs specialist and dyslexia expert. Now, dyslexia has been a regular theme for many of the questions we've received, which is why we really kindly asked Dr. Helen to join us this morning. So although it wouldn't be appropriate to speculate why dyslexia has been such a regular theme, it does feel fair to say that teachers appear typically more aware of this type of need, even if they're not necessarily feeling as confident as they'd like to in terms of what this might look like for their learners. We know that early identification is important to meeting learners' needs, and whatever their profile of strengths and challenges, understanding and responding to these promptly will give every learner the greatest opportunity for success. So without me continuing to talk, I will hand over to Emma, who is going to get us started this morning.
Thank you, Polly. We are super excited to have Helen join us. She's sort of an advocate and an expert on all things dyslexia. So we're really going to benefit from her and try and wring every last drop of expertise out of her today. So brace yourself, Helen. Yeah, our first question, Polly's already alluded to this. And we know that teachers have different levels of knowledge and confidence, don't they, when they're practitioners in the classroom, in terms of understanding and identifying some of those potential strengths and challenges that might relate to something like dyslexia or other needs. And I know that you work quite closely with families and with schools and with lots of young people who might have varying different needs. But can you give us, maybe to get us started, some tips, some indications of the type of things that our colleagues listening and those that might listen later could look out for in a classroom? Things that might be, I guess, indication for further investigation.
Absolutely. I think it's a classic thing, but it's a classic thing because it's a real thing, as it were. Often you'll get students who they can talk brilliantly, they can explain stuff, or they can make their understanding of a concept known verbally and or with pictures. Just they can show brilliance in their grasp of things, in their articulation, their kind of perspective of the world. But then if you ask them to write it down, it's like there's a block. And so there'll be the discrepancy as a word is really, like, it's a controversial word because people don't like it, but you will see there's a difference between sort of verbal capacity or sort of capacity to explain oneself or show knowledge versus then what comes out on paper. So and actually, when you're looking at sort of screeners and things like that, if you've got online profilers, if whatever flavour of data your school takes, if there's some sort of academic potential measures, so from GL it's CATS, there's MIGIS as well, there's various measures, that kind of thing. Academic potential might be up here, but then you'll sort of see spikes and wobbles in other bits of data where reading or spelling, writing might be not so high, maths might be better. You're looking for a difference, and whether that's in data or what you see in the classroom, and you'll probably see both because you know your kids if you're working with them. And I think quite often, and as a marker of general specific learning difficulties, executive function and working memory is a thing that gets all of them. So there's the most wonderful diagram. I should have said, I didn't think to share this actually before, if you Google Mary Colley spelled Colley, neurodiversity diagram, you'll get a picture And it's like, if you look in Google Images or Bing Images, whatever you use, there's a picture of a Venn diagram, and it's got kind of dyscalculia, dyslexia, ADHD, different learning difficulties, how you want to phrase it. In the middle is the kind of thing that's the commonality, and that's working memory, and that hits organization, sequencing things. In some ways it can be processing as well, so kind of word finding, information filing things in and out. So you might get kids that just, you can see them cogs turning, and then you'll see that I've got it. So it's just, it's or if they don't look like they're paying attention. So if you've got a kid who is basically a really good student who wants to learn, but sometimes they just miss a bit, and they're the kind of things then that can prompt sort of staff members and family people around children who work with them and who engage with them, because sometimes it's sports coaches. Because also, actually, holding on to verbal information and lists of instructions, a boy I assessed the other day plays really high level rugby. And one of the things I asked him was like, if they tell you what to do versus if they show you what to do. And he's like, no point telling me. I just need to watch the drill, then we can do it. And I was the same actually at university when I played rugby. I was like, I don't understand what you've told me. Let me watch. So these are the kind of things then, the things that you see in behaviour, in attainment, in kind of holistically, because it is a holistic thing. These are the things that then might prompt sort of teachers, families, people to pick up their spidey senses and start looking at screeners, or start just watching that little bit more closely. Yeah, so, and I think one of the things I think it's really important to be aware of is if somebody doesn't appear to be paying attention. I did choose my words carefully there, because sometimes we're human. Sometimes we zone out. That's human. If I'm not in a
True enough. I think we're all guilty of that, aren't we?
Yeah,
Thank
absolutely.
you. That's a helpful place to get us started, Helen. Polly.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. It's certainly advice I would have appreciated when I was a teacher in the classroom. When you're trying to work out different children's profiles and how to support them, it's really useful information. So our next question, and an area that I certainly experienced in my role as an inclusion lead, is that topic of diagnosis. So Helen, how can educators and parents navigate that room to a formal diagnosis, particularly where access to assessment services may be very limited, or actually on the other sort of flip side, they may be privately managed?
Yeah, I mean it's an absolute minefield. Now I live in Wiltshire, so our SENS, I can't remember what it stands for, but our local authority team are just wonderful. They're like the nicest people in the world. They do such amazing work, and they're so accomplished. We are so privileged in Wiltshire that we've got a team who acknowledge that dyslexia exists. Warwickshire, where I grew up, does not, or doesn't engage with dyslexia. Staffordshire is one of the first ones that started to stop engaging with dyslexia, as it were, and this is sort of 5-10 years ago. So kind of one of the points you asked me to, we've kind of discussed before, was looking at different local criteria and definitions. Now there don't tend to be different definitions locally of dyslexia, purely because those people that are involved in psych services, specialist assessor services, we have definitions that we have to work to within our professional jurisdiction. There's one in the pipeline that's still being reviewed. It's under academic review, as best I understand it, the Delphi definition. So I don't tend to use that yet, because it hasn't gone through the process. Now, that's not to denigrate the work. The work is brilliant, but academic reviews, it takes a while. So the definitions tend to be fairly consistent within the UK. Scotland has, within England, fairly consistent. Wales tends, as I best understand it, to stay with England in definition. Scotland has a different one. It's a really well-written one. I can't remember the detail, but it's brilliant when I've read it. So the criteria definitions for dyslexia are fairly consistent. The problem we've got is availability of within the local authority bodies, or within MATs as well, multi-academy trusts in England. There aren't enough ed psychs nationally. There's a shortage. So educational psychologists, sorry. There's a national shortage. Specialist assessors, again, there's not that many. And we don't, and there aren't enough of us. So that's before you look at how we're distributed. So there's just not enough people to do the assessments. And then there's so few local authorities that have capacity to do full assessments. Now, the SEND system within England, within Wales to some extent. Scotland, again, I have some knowledge, but it's not solid in my head, so I don't want to speak to it and get it wrong. But it's very much needs-based here. So diagnoses nominally are not needed. But even then, getting somebody to come out and do a really good, thorough assessment of where is somebody wobbling and why is like finding hen's teeth, because there just aren't the bodies. So it's really difficult to get a person who has all the letters after their name and all the requisite pieces of paper to come and do a diagnosis. So much of it's privately managed. In an ideal world, my job as a private practice assessor would not exist. I would be under a local authority. Multi-academy trusts are a different discussion. Save that for another day. But as it stands, I'd be working for the public sector, going around schools. But there just isn't the funding. So there is a real sort of have and have not problem with this. And I'm lucky that I'm able to do some stuff for lower cost rates, and where I can, I do as much as I can for free, or as on a sliding scale. And I think a lot of assessors do, but we're human. We have mortgages, so it's a really difficult situation. And sometimes the people who you want to help the most, because you might have parents who've had a terrible journey with education themselves, navigating this, who do I talk to? I've got to go to the school. I don't want to go to school. If you're a parent who's just endured school, then going to the establishment that has made your life really difficult to try and look at your children's journey and to try and unpick what's going on there can be really intimidating. And then if you've got to engage with the paperwork associated with assessments, it can be really difficult. On a few occasions, I've sat or phoned parents and we've gone, you tell me, I'll write it down. So, because I need some of the information about a kid, but it's a really difficult situation. So this is where kind of Senkos and class teachers are like gold dust, are just absolutely wonderful. Because they can give the answers that people might need, and they know the kids. Does that make sense? That's the question.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. I think definitely, like particularly in the UK, I know we sort of talked about UK based and we've got international colleagues with us, but hopefully there'll be some commonalities there. But I think it moves brilliantly onto our next question, where whether there is a diagnosis or not. And as we know, that the label doesn't fix the barrier, it helps us to understand it and it helps us to put things in place. But whether there is that diagnosis or not, what would you sort of say are some evidence-based, maybe practical strategies that teachers or people on this webinar can implement to support those students with those dyslexia related challenges? So whilst we haven't got that absolute diagnosis, what are those gold things that we can be doing at the moment?
Well, there's a concept called universal design for learning. Limerick University in Ireland is doing loads and loads of work around this. So it's like an architectural principle where a building works for everybody and you don't have to retrofit ramps. That's broad strokes. I've literally written a paper and it should be, fingers crossed, coming out with Patos in due course. But the principle behind it is you make your lessons accessible to everybody. So in so doing, for example, and I realize it's broad strokes and it's so much as resource dependent, but things like having a little box on the middle of the table where you might have, I don't know, I haven't got any to hand, like a reading ruler, the coloured reading ruler, I think is with the line on. Crossbar Education do them, you can get them on Amazon, things like that. Or having access to sticky notes where kids can kind of maybe note down their ideas, mini whiteboards, dyslexia friendly dictionaries, different coloured pens, little boxes of resources that are on the table or available, so that word mats, spelling mats, sound mats, things like these, so that it's normalised, so it's just run of the mill. This is what we have in the classroom. If you need to pop and get a pen grit from the corner, you can. If you need a different coloured overlay, just bob and get it. And so it's not like please may I have something different. Kids aren't singled out. And so this kind of principle of universal design is building in inclusion, building in provision for everybody. And there are children, this is broad strokes, there are cases where it is going to be more complicated. I will, let's caveat everything with that. But broad strokes, for most kids, most of the time, having access to things like that can be really helpful. Now, depending on your school resources, on your kind of infrastructure, technology can be absolutely wonderful. I am the biggest fan, particularly as kids kind of get to upper key stage 2 and beyond, so like 9-ish onwards. Even before, some schools can be reticent, I understand why, but if a kid's got to do a big write and they may hold their pen like that, why on earth are we going, again, very extreme, but they might hold their pen so let them use a computer. If you have a computer, let them use it. I do write by hand. Nobody else sees that because nobody else needs to see my handwriting. And I think typing is a life skill. Word processing is a life skill. So for things like that, if you've got children for whom writing is an excruciating process, let them use tech. Or reading. I mean, I've just proofread something this morning. I had a request come through before this meeting. And I checked something and I use my computer to proofread it to me. Windows speaks aloud. Apple iOS has an equivalent where it talks to you. And you can also, all of the main operating systems, you can talk to them and they write what writes to you. My little boy loves the Windows Dictate. He thinks it's hilarious. But actually, it's a really powerful tool. And so these are built in to operating systems. There are some really lovely dictation packages that do more and a more sort of spandangled and shiny. But there's so much in your computer system that just needs somebody in the IT management hub to click activate on the bit of the system. I don't really know how it works, but it's there and use it. And that as part of kind of an adaptive teaching where kids can pick up their iPad or the other systems are available and pick up their tech, use it. Or if they want to write by hand, they can write by hand. If they want to take a photo of the board, safeguarding, important to have that considered. But there are things that can be done that are really flexible. And if you're in a school that's got that, it's really good. Now, there's one of the points we were sort of thinking about raising is evidence-based intervention. It's really difficult to draw comparisons across different interventions. I was part of a review with people who I'm a bit of a fangirl about now, actually. It was a real privilege in 2020. So just as COVID kicked off, I got a call from the DFE, which was really weird. And I thought somebody was taking the mickey. But we did a review, and my part of the job was to look at comparing interventions. And there's a lot of systematic reviews, but because how things are evaluated is so different, it's really tricky. Now, the Education Endowment Fund, it's brilliant. Absolutely wonderful work. So I would say if you're looking for evidence-based interventions, there's lots of them, but a lot depends on all the different factors that you're setting your kids are looking at. So if you want really good, robust evidence, look at the Education Endowment Fund, because they have like little pound signs if it's, you know, cost, efficacy in terms of attainment. Do kids like it as well? Do kids engage? So that's a really good place to look at for things like that, because it covers lots of bases and it's really robust. They've got a brilliant team at the EAF. I couldn't respect a lot of their work more. So, nice one, Emma. Thank you. You popped it in the chat. Thank you.
No worries. I'm trying to make sure that colleagues who are online, who particularly those who might be overseas, and there's some terminology that Helen's using because it's part of her kind of common reference, are clear on. You referenced the DFE, which the three of us are obviously very familiar with, but people internationally might not know that that's our Department of Education in the UK. And there are, just to draw people's attention to it, there are a couple of other links that I put in there. Helen mentioned PATOS, for example. That's a UK-based organisation that does a lot of support. And of course, there are a lot more. We mentioned in October in our episode when we were reflecting on the international conference that the BDA hosted. And so don't forget to look for them as well. That's the British Dyslexia Association. And a lot of what Helen just referenced in her kind of practical strategies really resonated with me, because I've now got a 22-year-old son, but a laptop was the turning point for him when he was in year 5 and opened up the world of opportunity. So, you know, do take those things really quite seriously. We don't have to be doing sort of remarkable things sometimes. It's those small universal design adjustments that can make the world of difference. We have had a couple of questions that have come in chat, but I think what I might do, rather than take too much of people's time today and Helen and put her on the spot, we might actually bend Helen's arm and see if she might come back for a future episode, if she's willing to, because I think that I think there's likely to be lots of more ongoing dyslexia themed questions that come in. There's things related to kind of exam application, there's things related to dysorthography, so some fascinating things to perhaps go away and reflect on and come back on another day. But for now, at this point in our episode, we normally move on to what we call our illuminations, which is what we'd encourage you to do now, next, and then. And we're quite used to using that language with some of our learners who might be experiencing some barriers in terms of planning those next steps, in terms of maximising support for your students. But I'm going to put Helen back on the spot and ask if we can squeeze that last drop of wisdom and experience and practical advice. If there was one thing, Helen, this is a hard question, I know, but if there was one thing that you'd recommend to colleagues to take immediate action or reflection on today, what do you think that would be from you?
I had to think about this over my gallon of coffee just between our sessions. Check your PowerPoints. Font, spacing, colour. I'm dyslexic, it's no secret. If a font is with serif, so like Times New Roman with the like flicky bits that join the letters together, it's just a faff. It's very tricky to read. So if you have a nice like smooth round font, something like Arial or Calibri, or the new one is it Aptos that Microsoft uses.
I like Aptos, yeah.
Really, it's nice and bubbly. And the reason that it's nice is because there's not the kind of confusion of the lines between the letters that sort of makes them just don't like it. It makes me pull a face. I've just looked at my own face. And alongside that, spacing out your lines, so kind of 1.5 line spacing can be really helpful. A nice pale background, because dyslexia is not visual stress, but they're co-occurrent quite often. And also just dyslexia, if you see loads of text, you go, ooh. So lots of space. And if you reduce the contrast with a sort of paler, pastel-y background, it can just be a game changer. So space, no serifs, pale background, check your PowerPoints. It's quick and it's easy.
Great advice, thank you. I'm just going to, in fact, Polly, can I put you on the spot and see if you can just search for the BDA's dyslexia friendly guidance, and if we could put that in chat, because that is definitely some really helpful guidance and builds out on what Helen's just suggested. From our perspective, at the risk of some shameless plugs, just to finish off in terms of those next step things that we could do. The first I would suggest is visiting Helen's website, which she's been too kind not to mention, but I'm going to make sure that we do. And that would be www.helensplace.co.uk, where you'll find some helpful resources and information. And then the next thing that we'd say is make sure that you consider joining us for next month's Send Searchlight, because we're going to kind of pick this up, but from a slightly different angle, because we know that language, and I'm sure Helen will nod in agreement here, is underpinning a lot of those kind of good literacy development things. And it will be part of what Helen factors in when she's thinking about identification. So understanding where those challenges are and how that might then relate to that wider literacy thing is quite important. And Helen touched upon the kind of co-occurrence and thinking about kind of where there might be some of those connections. And I think it's probably fair to say that our professional experience, certainly mine, is that we can often be inclined to spot challenging behaviour, but we don't necessarily always dig into why that might be so. And in some cases, that could be because there's something going on with language. And we've had quite a lot of those questions come in about the speech language communication, or SLCN, versus SEMH, social emotional mental health. We do love an acronym, don't we, when we're talking about additional needs. And so we're going to pick that up next month with another wonderful expert. This time Beth Morant is joining us. She is a practicing speech and language therapist with lots of wisdom and experience to share with you in the same way that Helen has. So it remains for me to say a massive thank you to Helen for giving her time to us and sharing so much wisdom. We do appreciate it. But then to ask you guys to join us again on the 11th of February, another Tuesday episode. and to keep an eye open for any of our future 2025 episodes as we continue to address those questions that come in. Do keep them coming, and do take the opportunity, Polly's just popped on screen, to share your feedback, because you're helping us to shape what these Send Searchlight webinars do for you. And that's why we're able to reach out to people like Helen to ask for them to share their experience. So thank you all for joining us. We do hope you have a wonderful 2025, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Helen.
That's all right. Do you need me to stay on for a minute or two afterwards? I can do.
What will happen is the recording will be ended by our colleague. So everybody who's heading off to work or finishing up for the day, have a great rest of the day.